Okay, so we have both of the drive shafts removed from the transfer case. We've removed the starter motor and the clutch slave cylinder. And right now Cody is removing the bell housing to engine bolts. Before we can remove anything, we also have to remove the exhaust from the engine. Remove any levers and electrical connectors on the transfer case. And after we have the transmission unbolted from the engine, we will remove this cross member on the frame and be able to slide the transfer case and transmission back so that we can see the clutch assembly. Now we have the transmission cross member support removed. We have a jack underneath the transmission. There's the transfer case right there, all clear, and we're ready to slide everything back. As you can see, we have pushed the transmission and transfer case assembly back as far as it could go. So the clutch assembly is now exposed. We have the flywheel. This is the pressure plate, friction disc inside. And inside the bell housing here is the input shaft splines. And this is the release fork. And that is the release or throw out bearing. And the slave cylinder pushes on the end of that release fork to throw the bearing forward to disengage the clutch. Our next step was to remove the transfer case to ease an assembly of removing the transmission. Now, if this seal back here in the back of the transmission goes bad, when you pull the transfer case out, you'll dump fluid out of your transmission. So if your transmission is low and you pull this out and all of it rushes out that way, you need to replace this rear seal of the transmission. There's the pressure plate and the rest of the clutch assembly now fully in view for us to work on. And here's our removed NV 3500 transmission. Now our next step is to remove the pressure plate from the flywheel. Be sure to look at the specific instructions for your vehicle that you're doing. On this particular truck, we had to mark the pressure plate to the flywheel because it is weighted and we need to know how it goes back together. And when removing the pressure plate bolts that attach to the flywheel, you're going to want to remove them and install them in a star pattern. And don't take them all at once. Loosen each bolt 1 to 2 times and then go on to the next bolt. And then loosen that one 1 to 2 times, go on to the next bolt, and so on. And do that until the spring tension of the pressure plate is relieved. So now that we've got everything apart, we're going to want to check for runout on the flywheel to make sure that it's smooth, so that you can have a smooth engagement of the clutch, and so that you don't have any vibrations or clutch slipping. So we've got a dial indicator right on the flywheel. Alright, so we've gone all the way around with the flywheel. Looks like our max runout was 0.003 of an inch. For this particular truck, it's a 95, It didn't have any available specifications for the runout on the flywheel. However, it's always a good idea to look on your vehicle what the specs are, because if it is out of runout, that might indicate, if you had a vibration or clutch slipping before, that could indicate what your problem was. We can also see here, there's lots of hot spots, just heat discoloration. This is from, it could be a bad unadjusted clutch linkage. On this one, it was just the clutch was ridden a lot and caused it to get heat spots. So in this case, we would want to machine the flywheel, resurface it. Check your flywheel. Not all flywheels can be machined. Sometimes you have to replace it. But if it can be machined, it's always a good idea to just go ahead and machine it when you're putting on a new clutch. Okay, so this is our clutch friction disc that we pulled out. This is the actual part that wears in the clutch easily. This is the friction material. Just look for any scores going all the way around. If you have any chunks missing, you definitely need to replace it. Look for any heat discoloration on it. Also check and see if it's oily, if you've got any oil contamination on there, because that'll make the clutch grab and slip and shatter. And that can be caused by a rear main oil seal or a transmission leak. These are the torsional coil springs, and this is the hub. And it just kind of moves there. These spline onto the input shaft of the transmission, and this is allowed to spin just a little bit so that when the clutch is engaged, it just makes it more smoother by allowing it to give a little bit. Alright, here we have the pressure plate we pulled off of the Chevy over here. I got a straight edge and feeler gauge to check your clearance and see how much it is worn down. As you can see on this, there are hot spots like we're on the flywheel here. This is from the clutch getting way too hot, slipping, mostly when you take off. When you replace the clutch, it comes with a new pressure plate, so there's no machining required on this. There's springs back in here that pull the pressure plate back, which disengages the clutch from the flywheel, and that allows you to shift in other gears. And now we're about to install our friction disc. Before you do anything, it's a good idea to look back here on the rear main oil seal of the engine. If you have any oil seeping out, you definitely, while you have this apart, go ahead and replace the rear main oil seal, because that oil will contaminate your new clutch and cause bad clutch operation. And even if it's not leaking, if it's a vehicle with 150,000 miles or more, you might just want to go ahead and replace it while it's out, because it might leak in a couple more thousand miles. This is the pilot bearing right here. That'll usually come with your new clutch kit. That's what the input shaft rides in. You want to replace that. When you disengage your clutch, if you start to get a rumbling noise or a grinding, that's usually the cause right there. So, got all that taken care of. We have a clutch aligning tool. Now we'll align the friction disc in the proper point. Remember the aligning marks we made. Make sure you have them lined up to the flywheel. Just got to put the bolts on loosely to hold it right now. You know what I love? The fact that this is made in South Africa. So here we're going to torque the pressure plate in a star pattern. You don't want to tighten them all the way down. You want to do a couple turns on each one, going around in a star pattern until they're snug, and then torque them to spec. Alright, we're going to torque this pressure plate to 30 pounds in a star pattern. go, torqued. Now that we've got the pressure plate and clutch buttoned up, we're ready to install our transmission again. This is the release fork. This little cup right here is where the slave cylinder attaches. When you push the clutch pedal down, it pushes that, which pushes the release bearing forward to hit the spring fingers on the clutch, which releases the pressure plate from the clutch disc, the friction disc, and the flywheel to disengage the clutch. This is the release bearing or the throwout bearing, and every time you put in the clutch, that spins. If you get a grinding noise, like when you first start to put in the clutch, you hear a little rumbling, that could be this. Just spin it, make sure it spins freely, or you can go ahead and replace it. This is where the seal would be for the front input shaft of the transmission. If it's seeping at all, go ahead and take this apart and put on a new input shaft seal, and that way you won't have any transmission or gear fluid coming out and contaminating your clutch. After we have the bell housing bolted to the engine, we bolt up the starter motor, and then we bolt the slave cylinder onto the transmission bell housing. Now in that little access hole, hopefully you can see that little rod in there, and that rod is engaging the end of the clutch fork. Now when you put in the slave cylinder, be absolutely sure that you feel and or see that push rod go into the end of the clutch fork in the bowl there. Otherwise, when you put in the clutch won't come back up, and that push rod could blow right out of the slave cylinder and damage your bell housing. Now we've lifted up the transfer case, and we're bolting on the transfer case, and next we'll put in the cross member to support it all. Alright, so we've got everything buttoned up. We've installed the shifter linkage back in. Everything goes into gear. The clutch feels good. Now we'll make sure it drives. There we go. New clutch is working good. Everything is good to go.